And now I'm going to share my screen.
Do we get royalties?
So, as you know, this is a program for research on Black Americans' celebration of James Jackson's life. And we just want to let you know a few things before we get started. So number one, for all participants, please mute, okay, when you're not talking. We won't have the time for everybody to introduce themselves. So please type your name and affiliation in the chat box. That way people will know who's on. If you want to speak, and there'll be time for people to speak, besides the confirmed speakers, please ask Harold Neighbors in chat. And Harold, I'm sorry, why am I saying Harold? Woody and I are the co-host of this memorial service. And again, please limit your comments to 3 to 5 minutes. And I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So these are the confirmed speakers, and in the order that we have that for people who are confirmed. After that, we will have time for anybody else. We will do our best to get as many people in as possible. And what I will be doing is giving maybe 10 minutes or so about James's contributions. And the main contribution that I'm gonna talk about, I should say the only contribution I'm gonna talk about, is his mentoring. And obviously there are lots of other things we can discuss, but most of the other stuff is relatively public. People, even PRBA people, don't really know the extent of the numbers of generations of mentoring. So that's what we're going to discuss. So first, one little quick point. I have a play aunt. She passed about 2 or 3 years ago, named Jimmy Frazier, and she taught James in the 4th grade in Inkster. And as you know, she was from Inkster and James from Inkster. And they were able to meet. They met at my house once or twice for different events. And she always said that James was really smart and intelligent, especially to be so young. So here's the outline of what I'm covering. A lot of the stuff I'm just gonna ask you to read as opposed to me going through it all. And as you know, we started in 1976, and I started about the summer of 77. And what we know is that the PRBA's had a tremendous influence on the number of scholars, African-American scholars in particular. And when you listen to Jerry Gurin always said that was a major emphasis of James, to make sure that training was a major part of what PRBA did. So it's impossible to really cover all the people that James has mentored, as you can see from this diagram. However, we do know a fair amount, and so these are the people that we're going to cover. And as you know, PRBA is unique in that we had a very interdisciplinary approach. This is the publication record of the National Survey of American Life as of May 2020. And I only want to point out one thing. There have been 65 dissertations from NSAL. So part of what we do, and that I'm not going to talk about a lot, is the number of summer workshops that we give. So we've been giving summer workshops throughout the history of PRBA, but really more steadily in the last 20 years. And these are some pictures for some recent ones. And you can tell this one was from last year because it was virtual. And this is part of Brianna Metsup, who's a PRBA faculty member. And she's the PI on this. And me, James, and Cleopatra Caldwell, and you see Cleo speaking, are co-PIs on that summer program. One thing that you see with the National Survey of Black Americans is these are the PIs and the co-PIs. And everybody was young when they started. But what you see is that Belinda became the Associate Dean of the Graduate Division of UCLA. Phil Bowman, who you'll hear from a little bit later. There's a Bowman Lecture at the University of Illinois, Chicago, named after our good friend, Phil Bowman. And as many of you know, Jerry Guerin, who's one of the founders of ISR, passed last year. So these are some of the accomplishments of the National Survey of Black Americans graduate students. So these are students who worked on the National Survey of Black Americans. One of the important things of having a program like this that's been around for 42 years, 44 years, is that you can really see what people have done over the course of this period. These are the former students that and postdocs. 9 of us have become full professors at U of M, and the only African American woman full professors in the history of public health and social work have some level of PRBA training, either through pilot studies or students. The only person who wasn't was one of the deans of a Black woman who's a dean of social work. So go to HBCU, and we don't have a lot of pictures of people, but we have a few, and only Kendrick because he's now a provost. So we have a lot of associate provosts, and this was just named about 2 weeks ago. And again, he's a former student. These are some other former students and postdocs. Again, Ruby Beal, Angela Cole Dixon, and this is all with HBCUs. Susan Fraser Kwasi and Brian Marks. These are our former students and postdocs who are now in governmental service. And again, there's no time to list everybody, but this is just to give you an idea of the scope and the number. These are leadership of alumni in various universities across the country. As we know about Prudence Carter, of course, Laura Cornwood, Tom Leviste, Sean Joe, Cheryl Sellers, Rupert Nacoste, and Vicki Mays are 2 of our earliest postdocs. These are some other people that many of them you may know, some of them you may not. Jacqueline Matisse was just named the dean, just started 2 months ago. Barbara Guthrie. Sorry, I can't remember where university she is. That's a mistake. And of course, Phil Bowman is founding director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity here at University of Michigan. Some more research areas of selected PRBA alumni. And all these people are leaders in their fields. And again, I just let you read this. And we're going through all of this because none of this would happen without James and his leadership. Absolutely none of this. These are some pioneers in African American gerontology, and I'm saying that because they're articles that that mention that this group are people who are pioneers. Rose Gibson was the editor of the Gerontologist, and to date, she's still the only African American editor of a major gerontology journal. This is an article about citation analysis for African American faculty in social work. And of the top 20 people. 18 of us are former PRBA people. Again, this is no accident. It's both a combination of people working hard and a combination of having good training. And next, I want to talk about the sort of the next generation. And for our established scholars, many you may not know many of them, but Morgan Gerald, Krim Lacey, Michael Esposito, Stephanie Cook, Jocelyn Lee, Katrina Ellis, Jamie Mitchell, and Courtney Cogburn, just to mention a few. This is how we've done a lot of our mentoring as of late. We have a mentoring group that meets roughly once a month. It started with maybe 3 or 4 people with at our house with me and Linda Chatter's house, and it's grown to a list of about 45 people. One of the people here, and I'm not sure if you can see this on my screen, is Patricia Louie, and I know she's here on this call. This is also a young woman who's not at Michigan, but we really want to be involved. And she's at Adelphi, and this is the one time she was visiting, but most of the time she Zooms in. Again, you can tell when this happened. This is after the pandemic hit. And again, just to mention a few of our younger faculty that we feel really great about. So we have a few pictures. And we brought in this picture of Rihanna Anderson that y'all might have seen on CNN and MSNBC and other shows. And Ann Gwynn at Case Western. Mosi Afantuji at Wisconsin. Fantasy Lazada at Virginia Commonwealth. She was a member of one of our postdoc groups a few years ago. Lauren Brown, who was just in one of the pictures, and she's a new professor at San Diego State. Christina Cross, who's at Harvard. This is a picture from the 40th reunion. And if you go from the left, you see Wayne McCullough. That's Carl Hill and James Jackson. The late Carl Bell, AJ Franklin. And again, I can't go through everybody, but here's our youngest member, Judah, who some of y'all saw earlier here. And I'm going to end this now. This is, again, just to give you an idea how the impact that James has had and the fact that this legacy is continuing. So I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, give me a second. I just want to remember who's next. So Woody, you are next.
Okay, yeah, I was doing my job monitoring the chat. So if anybody wants to send a request, I'm keeping an eye on the chat. And I've sent a few messages out already to a few people. So you can take a look. And I've had to cut my remarks this evening. I actually thought Robert was giving me 35 minutes, but I now understand it's only 3 to 5 minutes. So I'm just going to mention, I think I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what Robert said earlier about the profound mentoring. I'm sure a lot of people will comment about James' mentoring, but I'm just going to tell 2 quick stories about James as my mentor. So I got lucky that James was assigned to me as my academic advisor. So I came to Ann Arbor to get a PhD in social psychology, and was assigned to James. So he didn't start out as my mentor, but as things developed, he became the lead mentor for me. There are other mentors of mine on the call tonight. Phil Bowman, Belinda. I've learned a lot from everybody. But James was a very interesting mentor. I'll just say that one of the things he did for me was that he actually took me on trips with him. And that's one thing, when your advisor actually starts taking you around the country and introducing you to people and making you part of a network of investigators, that's really when you know you have a mentor, and a very good mentor. A lot of people have asked me, what's the difference between an advisor and a mentor? And I think that's the difference. You really get to know a mentor, and they really open up a whole world for you. I'll never forget the first time James actually took me to NIMH. And I knew there was an NIMH because I've been doing my reading, I was doing my homework. But he actually took me there, and I can remember my amazement as I walked up to this building, and it suddenly hit me that NIMH was a big building with lots of people in it. I don't know what I was thinking before that, but it just made it come alive for me. And I just followed James into that building, and we just walked up and down the hallways, and I was like, I didn't know you could do this. And I actually met in person people I was reading. So for example, I met Ben Locke, I met Mildred Cannon, I met Bill Eaton, I met Sherm Raglan, I met Delars Perron. Some of these names won't mean anything to folks, but you can look them up. Some of you know who I'm talking about. And it just blew my mind. Yeah, I see a thumbs up from Norm. It just blew my mind to actually be sitting in front of people talking to them when the day before I was reading their article. So that's all I'm going to say about James. He was an all-star mentor for me. And then I'm going to close by, just giving you one of my favorite James Jackson travel stories. One time James asked me to go with him to Toronto to be part of a presentation on the National Survey of Black Americans to the Black psychiatrists who were meeting. So we went, I can't tell the whole story because I don't have time, but I'm going to tell the favorite part of my story is actually departing from this Toronto conference. By the way, this is when I first met Carl Bell. And that was an amazing experience to meet Carl. So after the conference, James took me out to dinner, and we had a nice, relaxing meal. And time got away from us, and we suddenly realized that we were at risk for being late to the airport. So my blood pressure starts rising, but I'm with James, so I'm trying to be cool. Most of the time I traveled with James, I was nervous, scared, anxious, and excited, all rolled up into one. So I'm trying to be cool. And we go get in our rental car. And for some reason, James wanted me to drive, so I drove. And so I immediately got lost, took a wrong turn somewhere. So we're on the freeway trying to get to the airport so we don't miss our flight, and we're lost. So I find myself behind a taxi cab. So James says to me, pull up beside that taxi cab, and I'm going to roll down my window and ask him to lead us to the airport. So I pulled up beside the taxi, and James rolled down his window, and they're having a conversation. And I couldn't believe it, but the taxi driver says, okay, follow me. And I'm not a taxi driver, so I don't drive like a taxi driver, but this guy was zooming in and out, back and you know how taxi cab drivers drive, you know. I kept up with him and we made it to the airport. So I'm like, wow, this is really not the way I like to travel, but I guess this is the way James travels. So we get to the airport. Long story short, we're sitting there waiting for them to announce boarding. And just as they say it's time to board, James says to me, hey, let's go get a drink at the bar over here. So I'm like, should we be getting on the flight? And he's like, nah, we got plenty of time. We got plenty of time. So I will never, ever forget that story. And that's what it was like for me to travel with James. So, you know, I've got lots of funny stories like that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to close there. But if you can imagine what it was like to be zooming up and down the highway, trying to follow a taxi cab, and then going to get a drink when everybody else is getting on the flight. I will never, ever forget that experience, but it was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Woody.
To hang around with James. I'm
Thank
done.
you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks.
Miss Belinda Tucker.
All right, I'm off mute, yes. Thank you both Woody and Robert for those, you know, those memories. Before I start telling some of the stories, I want to emphasize that this is a generational impact. You know, those of us who learned to mentor under James, then started mentoring using the Jackson model, you know, our own students. So there are now, you know, a couple, at least two, maybe there's three by now, generations of scholars now who all came out of PRBA. I want to talk for a few minutes about how young we all were when this whole enterprise started. You know, I met James when I came into graduate school. When I came into graduate school in Michigan, James was starting there. I was 22, he was 27. I don't know if you can imagine that. James was 27. And he acted like any other 27-year-old. I mean, we all have kids now. Many of us have kids who are way older than 27, but remember what your kids were like when they were 27. So that was James leading a bunch of even younger people, trying to do these studies that, you know, ran counter to, you know, the ISR model of doing things. So, you know, they're thinking, what do these kids know about research? So, you know, on some level, you know, I think part of the pushback was because we were also young and James himself was young. So by the time, you know, NSBA got started, I think he had just turned 30 or 31 or 32, but yes, he was a youngster and we were all, you know, young kids under him. So we didn't do things the way everybody else did them. James had a drive that was incredible. I mean, he could go days without sleep, I think. In fact, you know, shortly before we launched the NSBA study, you know, James passed out from exhaustion for, you know, before one of our meetings because he was driving himself so much, but he taught us to drive ourselves the same way. So all-nighters were a thing of regularity. As somebody said earlier, we didn't have computers. So we had to type and retype and retype. And I can recall that our typist at the time, Paul, you know, would try to catch a break by sleeping on the floor in ISR when we got the new pages to him because we were changing all the time. And we were finalizing the study. I remember having to tell Woody, and I guess he had to tell Bonita that section F, that was Woody's section, was going to be discussed at 2 a.m. And, you know, people did not think that there was something crazy about that. Okay, section F is at 2, you know, another section's at 3, another section's at 4, and we just went along with the program. So I think we all, you know, kind of now carry that drive with us. I know when I took off and went to UCLA, I was kind of surprised that people were not pulling all-nighters in the same way, that, you know, I didn't have this whole staff of people, you know, who were going to be there with me all night as we worked on the next proposal. But that was life there. I have another little travel story that, you know, that parallels Woody's. I didn't know other people traveled with James in the same way. I had to get to the airport, and James, you know, he was a young guy again. He had a 240Z, I can remember, a fast car, right? And I thought I was going to miss my plane. He says, I'll get you there. And I don't think I've ever been more terrified in my life, but we made it. Flying down I-94, James at the wheel with that 240Z. I mean, we must have been going 100 miles an hour, but I made it to the airport. So that was the James I know. Partying, you know, leading us. It was like the Pied Piper on some level.
Thanks, Belinda. Phil Bowman. And you have to unmute yourself, Phil. Phil, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Gotcha, yeah.
Okay, apologize. First of all, it's really, really great to see everyone. And thank you, Robert or Robert, for pulling this together. You know, it's, you know, a trying experience just to lose James, you know, and to have this opportunity to kind of, you know, deal with those emotions collectively with a group of people who were so close to him over so many years. I personally appreciate. You know, my comments will be, and I'll keep them within 3 to 5 minutes. Robert, you know, I'm sure you'll gladly be my timekeeper.
Okay.
But,
go ahead, yeah.
But just a few reflections. You know, first of all, I first came to Michigan in 1970. The only person on this call, really prior to James, and the only person on this call who was here is Kathy Burlew and Esther Jenkins. And I guess because Kathy was here, she did undergrad. Kathy, wherever you are. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So 1970, right? And that was the psych department in University of Michigan before Jameson. In some ways, you know, biggest comment is that NSBA and PRBA was part of James' transformative impact on University of Michigan as a whole, and the psych department in particular, because at that time there was not only there was very few graduate students and no faculty, zero faculty. So in some ways, it's historic to kind of think about the transformative impact that James had on the university, on the psych department, the University of Michigan, and on the University of Michigan as a whole. And PRBA really became one of his instruments for doing so. And Belinda, you came in about 71 or 2. 71, yeah. So you know, and that was, and in 71, James was still a graduate student. That's the other point. You know, Belinda's point that we were all graduate students. James came to Michigan initially. He did not have his dissertation done. You know, so we were all graduate students. You know, for that first period, and it was profound. You know, that this whole, you know, just mentioned a few themes. You know, I mentioned them earlier. James's eternal optimism. I've never met a person, you know, with that kind of optimism. Infectious, by the way, because if you didn't pick it up, he'd impose it on you. Secondly, vision. You know, at that time, James had a vision about PRBA. You know, we didn't know it, you know, but he had the vision, and he would share it. I think AJ mentioned that earlier. You know, he would talk about it in scripts, but it was profound when I think back about his infectious optimism and his vision, you know, for this PRBA, this NSBA, something like that in some ways was inspired by the Black Power movement. It was James's way and I think AJ mentioned this also, of thinking about how to bring the Black Power movement into academia, and not only desegregate, but also have something that was Black-centered, that was African-centered in the current parlance. You know, thirdly, James's charismatic leadership. I mean, when he came into Michigan initially, he was a graduate student. He was president of BSPA. You know, because he was still a student. Before the year was out, he was president of ABSI. I think probably before he defended his dissertation. And he was going to NIMH, really hooking up networks to do this study. He was on every panel or a group that would listen to either a graduate student or listen to someone advocating for Black people. James was on it. You know, so in some ways, you know, when I think about James, you know, it's kind of you know, humbling that we came together, you know, as graduate students along with a group of others. And there was two cohorts. There were a group of graduate students here before Belinda came in '71, who was not so friendly to James. James came in, and we were all graduate students. There was a group that was you know, more respectful for him, you know, to come in and desegregate the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan, because there had never been a Black faculty person here, and there were a group of graduate students, some of whom were more senior than him. You know, it was a group that was you know, finishing their dissertations or had completed his dissertation. So James came in a very tenuous, you know, situation, you know, having and at the same time doing all of this charismatic leadership stuff with ABSI at the national level, with the BSPA at the national, you know, running between recruitment and retention of Black students in psychology, as well as the need for things like the program for research on Black Americans. So he was a force, you know, and he was a force from the day I met him until the last conversation I had with him. You know, Robert, I think, can speak to the point that James was still spewing out proposals. You know, so you know, I'd like to, you know, just kind of, you know, end it with, you know, just this notion that, you know, this is a very, very special person who had a profound impact on me personally and all of us in those early days. You know, and we were part of not only again desegregating ISR, but desegregating the University of Michigan, desegregating psychology as a field. And James Jackson, I don't know anyone who played more of a charismatic leadership role in that phenomenon than James did. And in some ways, PRBA represented a kind of a tool or an instrument, you know, for him to play that role. And I'll close with just you know, something that always struck me about James, and I think that bonded us. You know, in some ways, he was 4 years. I'm a year older than Belinda, so he was 4 years older than I. But you know, I come in, when I met James, I had 2 children. You know, James had none, and not only had none, but like Belinda said, he was a very typical mid-20-year-old guy. So we had a very interesting relationship, because even though he was 4 years older, he would always respond to me like I was older. And largely because I'd had to, you know, leave the party and go home and take an extra job to feed 2 hungry kids. You know, so we had a very, very, you know, kind of close relationship in that regard. The second and final thing is him being from Inkster and me being from Saginaw. We had very similar background in the fact we had both worked in an automobile factory. You know, we both come from very similar kind of working class communities and neighborhoods. But, you know, I don't think, you know, James, we could do too much, you know, to celebrate and honor the profound impact that James Jackson had on all of us individually, and certainly in the legacy of the Program for Research on Black Americans, but his transformative impact, the University of Michigan. And I wish Pat and Jerry Gurin, you know, were very critical to, you know, not only being part of the desegregation process at the University of Michigan, but supporting James as the desegregator. You know, we use this term diversity these days. You know, before diversity, you had apartheid. You know, and when we came in, that's essentially what we had. That was the project. And James Jackson did a profound job, you know, and did it for 50 years, because that was 50 years ago.
Thanks, Phil. Really appreciate it. Next, Dr. Wayne McCullough.
All right. I have and always have had a different orientation to most of these matters, and I will start off by saying, you know, we are all shaped by our environments and the people around us, and that, of course, was no different for me. I came to Michigan, and incidentally, this is I'm celebrating my 50th year in doing survey research. And I came to Michigan having done my first survey research project 3 years prior, which was one of the reasons for coming to Michigan. And while I was trained in experimental social psych, it was really the survey research I wanted to run after. So first day on the ground at ISR, which is where we were all housed, I found a job. And I was trained as an interviewer for a validation project for Marty Gold. And I was then, quote, certified from that perspective. I did a number of other research activities building up to working on the National Survey of Black Americans, because I also did, Hal Fairchild's not on this, but you know, we did, you know, a project from the Youth Conservation Corps out of Prep. And I was a survey researcher and organizational person to the Corps. And I even did a grand piece of research with Pat Gurn on the counseling services at the University of Michigan. You know, every agency and students all over. So I was deeply steeped and wanted to more strongly pursue this. Well, like so many of my colleagues, I was hell-bent on getting out of there as soon as I could. And I was slated to kind of get out of there in the 77, 78 timeframe after working with my highly esteemed colleague, Esther Jenkins. We met for years on measures of collective action and common fate, you know, out of Pat Gurn stuff. And, you know, that's what I wanted to do. And then the opportunity of the National Survey of Black Americans came along. So I put my stuff on hold and said, I got to do this. And that's where it really helped to build the interviewer training. The identity section was there. And so I wrote one of the first dissertations off of the study. Now, I left ISR and the program and went into industry for 26 years, but I came back. And James, when I came back, really put me onto this notion, because as Phil said, this is a guy with vision, and he had lots of vision on many different things. And one of the things that we tried to get going was this large national survey of business organizations, you know, which had been done out of ISR many years ago, and he was trying to resurrect that. So we had Bob Kahn and all the other folk, you know, gathered, and we were going to do this. Well, we didn't have any young Turks, and unfortunately, you know, as we all were as graduate students. But then he had another one, which was, you know, Society 2030. So I did that with Tony Antonucci, and that was actually moderately successful. We brought in lots of business organizations. So for me, it was this whole notion about, you know, survey work. And James, you know, he did a lot of mentoring, but he didn't just do mentoring. James always met folk where they were. And because he met them where they were, I think he had some of the most successful and most expansive relationships with researchers and lots of other folks. and we had lots of names for him. Phil used to use the term Action Jackson. I had a couple for him, one of which was Captain James Jackson, because he was a Trekkie. But my favorite one, though, is actually I called him Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, not in the sense of, you know, beating folk down, but because of the vision thing. James had lots of different visions to achieve so many different things. And as you all know, when the fourth wing went on to ISR, that had never been done in this country in social science. James willed that money to come to ISR. And it wasn't just that one. James had back in his back pocket, he was going to have a wing 5. And so James was actually actively working on that one to make that one happen too. So, you know, for me, this notion about James Jackson having mentored quite a bit, he did. James had vision. And that vision is something that he worked on from when he first got to Michigan until the day he left us. And so I say all praises to James.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Wayne. Karen Lincoln. And for y'all who may not know Karen, Karen is on, like Belinda, on the West Coast.
Yes, I am looking at the hills and the smoke. So it's interesting. I have 2 airport stories. I had no idea there would be an airport theme. But as a student, I was privileged to be involved in a lot of grant proposal submissions, and there would always be a laundry list of grants that would be submitted anytime. And I'm not sure which grant this was, but I do know that we were very busy. And it was during the time where we had to submit hard copies of the grants to NIH and have 20 copies of the grant. So it was like a newsroom. There was just a lot of buzzing and people moving all along, and Dale was there sort of orchestrating and navigating everything. And there were piles of paper, and Robert and Linda tended to have their sections of these grants done early. So my job was to help anybody to do whatever they needed to do. And so we're waiting, and I believe we were waiting for James. We were waiting for him to finish his section, which apparently was not unusual. But people were very nervous because this whole box of these copies of grants had to be shipped out in order for them to be submitted on time. Needless to say, we missed the opportunity where we can submit those grants via mail. Mailroom had closed. There was no way that this grant was going to be submitted on time. So from what I understand, James decided to go to the airport and fly to NIH to submit the grant to ensure that it was submitted on time. I'm not sure whoever accepted that box from this man, what he said to this person, but apparently they accepted the grant, and PRBA lived to see another day, another decade, several more decades, because James was just so bold that he would think that it was okay to jump on an airplane and fly to the East Coast to submit his grant. The second airport story I have has to do with one of the traditions we had at PRBA for students like me to practice our presentations and job talks with PRBA faculty. So I remember I had a job talk at University of Washington, my first position, and I was super nervous about it. Robert insisted that I should apply for this position, even though I hadn't even written my dissertation proposal yet. David Williams was on my dissertation committee, Linda Chatters, Jim House, and Robert. And so I was pretty freaked out about flying there and giving a job talk. So I practiced my job talk in front of Linda, Robert, I think Kahari might have been there. There might have been some other people there. And I was super nervous, and I know it was awful, but Robert was very gracious and very kind. Didn't really say much about my talk, except that, you need to own it. Nobody in the country knows this like you do. This is your field, this is your area, you got to sell it. So then he says, just think, what would James say? And don't lie, because James lies. Well, he doesn't lie, but he like over exaggerates. So don't lie, just think, what would James say? So I said, okay, so I'm on my way to Seattle for my interview. I'm flying out of Chicago. There's an earthquake in Seattle. The plane turns around and goes back to Chicago. So I sit on the airport floor. I'm super nervous, hadn't slept in a week and a half. And I called Waldo Johnson because Waldo had finished his postdoc and he was now at University of Chicago. I'm in the airport of Chicago. And I said, any last tips for my talk? And so we chatted on the phone for a bit. About 6-7 hours later, I finally got a flight, landed in Seattle, didn't have any time to practice my talk. It was 2 a.m. So I did my job talk and I got through the talk fine. John Wallace actually had me redo the entire thing before I got on the plane, so I was very nervous. And I was waiting for the questions, and the sort of senior white male full professor decided he was going to ask me the hardest question that he could come up with. And I stood there and thought, you know, what would James say? I'm not sure what I said, but I saw his face. So apparently I was very convincing, very bold, did not lie, but they believed everything that I said. I got the job. It almost took me a year to actually take the job because I hadn't written my proposal yet. But because of that sort of, you know, spirit of James and be reminded to be bold and confident and own what you say, I also tell that to my students, except I say, you know, when they're nervous about their presentation or their interview or their job talk, you know, what would Dr. Lincoln say? And they sort of stand up straight and don't think that they're going to be able to say anything that I would say. And then they realize that they can. I said, if you can say what Dr. Lincoln can say, you know, just imagine how I felt being able to say what James Jackson would say, right? And so I get to tell them the story about James. And, you know, that was the piece of advice from Robert that, you know, not only landed me the job, but helped me to inspire other young scholars who were not quite confident in the work that they're doing, were very nervous about moving out into the field as an independent faculty member, but had the ability to do the work and have the ability to excel, but just didn't know it. So I just, you know, thank James for being able to mentor many of us in that way. And one quick thing I'll say in terms of negotiating for that position, I asked Robert, what should I ask for? And he was like, oh, child, I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been on a job interview. He said, but Prudence Carter and Derek Hamilton are on the market. So go talk to them. So I talked to Derek and I talked to Prudence, and they gave me excellent advice. And at that time, I believe Prudence had job offers, and she gave me key advice that I still give my students. One of the things she said to me when I said, well, when the dean comes back and counters, particularly about the salary, what do I say? And she showed me email messages that she had sent when she was negotiating for her position. And she said, use these words, in the spirit of fairness, I'm requesting this salary. And I tell my students all the time, in the spirit of fairness, because I asked for more than I wanted. I was offered less than I wanted. In the spirit of fairness, I got exactly what I wanted. So I want to thank Derek and Prudence and Robert, and most of all, James.
Thank you, Karen. Now we're going to talk to, or ask Eleanor Seaton to speak, and Eleanor is at Arizona State.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see everybody in the midst of COVID. So I have two stories about James. The first is a grant story, which was not successful. It was my first month or two at PRBA, and I was meeting with James. And he's like, yeah, you can work with NSL adolescent. And then he said, yeah, and you can submit a grant proposal. So I literally turned around to see if somebody else was in the room. Like, who is he talking to? He said, no, you can submit a grant proposal. What was I doing about maybe 3 or 4 months later? Working on an R03 to NICHD. And I didn't even submit just one proposal. I think I submitted about 3 before I left Michigan. But I remember that first meeting, like, who is he? Is he talking to me? And he said, yeah, you're going to submit a grant proposal. So Phil, when you talked about that infectious confidence, it's more like he tells you what to do and then you just decide to do it because it's like James said so. My second story actually happened before James and I actually met. So I was an undergrad at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And when I got down there, Phil Bowman was gone. But I took a class with James Anderson, who is James Jackson's equivalent in the field of education. And during one of his office hours, I went to go talk to James Anderson, and he told me, as a psychology undergraduate, you should go to graduate school. But more importantly, he said, I want you to talk to my friend James. So that's all he said. I said, okay. So this is the era of crappy dorm room telephones and even crappier answer machines. So I gave him my dorm room telephone number. And sure enough, maybe a couple of days after that, James called me. Well, we played telephone tag and we never talked. And eventually, it just, the communication died. I was in graduate school reading one of the articles from NSBA, and it occurred to me that James in college was James Jackson. So when I arrived at PRBA, I told James this story, like, you know what? I think we were supposed to talk in 1993, and I told him the story, and he said, yeah, that sounds like something that I would probably do. But I say this story because at that time, I was a 20-year-old undergraduate, living my best Delta life, just, unaware of graduate school. And at that point, James Jackson was 20 years into his career. He had already launched superstars like Phil Bowman, Woody Neighbors, Robert Taylor, Leonard Chatters, Letha Chadia, Cleo Caldwell. And he found time to call like a 20-year-old unknown, living her best party life student, not even knowing who I was or who I would be. And I just think that speaks volumes about who he was and who he sort of always has been. So I'm grateful that we didn't talk in 1993, because I probably wouldn't have appreciated it. But I'm also grateful that I ended up at PRBA and I still got to reap the benefits of his mentorship. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Robert, for the opportunity to talk about James.
And thank you everybody. I'm asking people also to check your chats. I've sent out 1 or 2 chats that are private, but yes, just to please check. And then our next person is Mosi.
Good evening, everyone. Like everyone else, it's just, I'm scrolling through all these faces, and it's really a beautiful sight to see everyone. I'll try to keep my comments kind of focused on a thing here, and that's this values effort at the PRBA. As we know in academia, oftentimes students and collaborators are selected first based on the perception of what their skill might be. And one of the things that I've come to learn and appreciate about the PRBA ethic is that oftentimes collaborators and students are picked because of their values. And then we transfer skills. And so, I am one of the younger folks. I like to think of myself as the NSAL generation. But I was more or less raised with the PRBA. Let's see. So one of the things that goes to this sort of values thing, there's so many different stories to tell, but one that I think is relevant is I ended up ultimately having a postdoc at PRBA. Up until that point, I didn't know anything about health. I didn't study health at all. I just didn't know anything. And there was a conversation about the SCHNOD working group, and it bent my ear, and I had some curiosity about it. And so I asked James if I could go. He was like, absolutely, sure. Here's the boom, boom, boom. He didn't ask me, right? Like, so what kind of work are you doing in health? What do you know? What are you going to contribute to the group, et cetera? You're just like, oh, you're interested? Okay, here, come on in. So I go to the meeting, and, I'd studied race and labor markets, immigration, but I knew nothing about health. And I guess it was about halfway through the meeting. I'm hearing all these acronyms and, all this health stuff. And I literally have no idea what's going on in the meeting. And so there's a point where I just have my hands down on my forehead, and James just starts laughing. And you guys who know James, he just had this belly laugh, and he would rub his legs while he was laughing. For some reason, that was a thing that he did. And so he leans back and he starts laughing, and I'm looking at him, and I'm like, well, what's so funny? You know, I'm wondering whether or not my feelings should be hurt. He looks around, he says, you know, I think we broke his brain. And I just started laughing, and I was just like, yeah, it's just so much new information. And he was just like, you know, don't worry about it, you know, things will come online. And basically, I continued to go to Schnod and eventually figured out what people were talking about, and eventually started publishing in the health area with folks from PRBA and with others. And I just want to say that, you know, I was invited to that meeting not because I knew anything about health or anything like that, but because I was invited to that meeting, I ended up knowing something about health. Now, there was another thing that he said to me, I think it was in that meeting or another meeting, that is sort of golden, is we were talking about career aspirations. And he said to me, he said, you know, never tell anyone what your goals are, because if you tell them what your goals are, they'll be able to control you based upon knowing your goals. And I just thought that was genius, because I think it can be true. I think it can be true. So I just wanted to say in brief that, you know, James was, I had a lot of different conversations with him over the years. And every one of them, I left a better scholar, a better person. And even on my first day of class, my first day of class, I end with a slide. Every first day of class, I end with a slide that has a picture of what I consider to be my intellectual genealogy. And so it's a picture of James, Phil, Tyrone, and me. And we got the news of James's transition just prior to, I think it was the day before class. And in my haste, I sort of just couldn't process stuff. And I had really just put it to the side. And I went and I gave my slides for the last day of class. And at the very last slide, the picture hits the thing. And, you know, I just choked up and cried in front of the first day of class. Wow. And the reason why I share that story is that there's very few professional relationships that allow for that kind of love, that kind of genuine love, that kind of family love. And James created a space for us to feel, to have a sense of home. And so, you know, as we say in the Yoruba tradition, Ibara Torun, may his soul rest in peace.
Thank you, Mousy. Derek Hamilton. And Derek, if I'm correct, was at Ohio State, and I think he felt better and decided to leave because he understands how Michigan and Ohio State get along. So he's back at NYU.
No doubt about it. I had to get out of that red state at Ohio State because of my Michigan blue roots. But I hope nobody from Ohio State is on this video, by the way. I'll deny it. No, let me say that we all perhaps think that we were at PRBA in its haven, but I feel like I was at PRBA in its haven, and I know that's not true by listening to the stories that I hear on this call, which is indicative that PRBA is always in its haven. It has always thrived, and it's been thriving for multiple generations. I love this family. This is an endearing family, and I'm privileged to be a part of it. Just thinking of so many linkages, my fellow postdocs that came through, the graduate students who were there at the time, the faculty. Phil Bowman spoke earlier, and he talked about the 2 children that he had to go feed and leave James. Those are two of my best friends in the world. So we're so connected in so many ways. And James is at the center of that. James was, in my mind, unapologetically Black and unapologetically a scholar. Those are the ways in which I see him. He didn't shy away from any of those identities. He demanded excellence, but he did it with a smile. He did it with an endearing, disarming smile, but didn't compromise at all on excellence. We had the best digs at Michigan. PRBA was in the penthouse of ISR. We had new furniture. We were the envy of the building, and that's how James rolled. And again, unapologetically Black and unapologetically a scholar. He transcended social psychology. He was a scholar beyond that in every respect. He knew a lot of information, was thoughtful, a visionary, like everyone described. There certainly was no ghettoization associated with James. Like I said, he had the best. He was a role model that set a model for how to be a role model. He showed up prepared whenever there was a time that he needed to mentor people and for our meetings. And despite having every leadership job on campus, he wore multiple hats. Like I said, he did everything to the fullest, and he was always prepared. And I appreciate that more now that I'm more of a senior scholar and realize the activities and endeavors that it takes to do so much, but yet still show up and be prepared and be ready for his students and postdocs. I think he enjoyed that most of his job. I really do. I really felt that the affection and the interaction he had with those that were coming up the pipeline were the things that gave him the most pleasure. I'm not going to drone on and on and on. I'm going to say that one of the most memorable things in my professional life was the send-off that we had at the end of our tenure in Michigan at his house, where, he, again, first rate, I have the expensive bottle of champagne. I never opened it. I don't know why I won't open it. Again, this is my ghettoization process where I don't feel worthy to open that bottle, but I still have that bottle, and one day I will open it. But I left that party feeling prepared and not anxious and belonging to any environment, and knew that I could not only survive, but thrive in any environment that I went to. James will leave a legacy where he will be in the pantheon of great scholars and won't be surpassed by anyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. And thank you very much. And as we know, when we talk Michigan and Ohio State, it's all in jest for most people. I don't take it that seriously. So just to give you the list of speakers that are coming up so everybody knows, Tom LaVise is next, followed by Jamie Abelson, David Williams, Cleopatra Caldwell, Courtney Cockburn, and AJ Franklin. So Tom, because I know Tom has to go for weather purposes.
Yeah, I didn't know that I was going to be speaking, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about James. And we're facing a hurricane threat here in New Orleans, so I may have to leave abruptly. So I think it was Derek that said that he was at PRBA during its heyday. And I think it was also Phil that said it. And I think it was also Woody that said it. But in fact, I was at PRBA during its heyday. So you're all wrong. I came to PRBA because I went to Michigan to do a PhD in sociology, and was there for just a couple of days on campus, and was talking to one of the professors over there who said, you really ought to go meet this guy named James Jackson over at ISR. And I said, well, okay. I didn't know who, I'm embarrassed to say at the time, I didn't know who James Jackson was. Went over and met James Jackson, and it was somebody else who's made a comment very similar to this. And the conversation went something like this. Oh, you're interested in doing research on Black people. Okay, well, I need you to come over tomorrow because I have some work for you to do, and I'm gonna need you to go to the library and get this. And it was just assumed that, yeah, you were gonna be a research assistant on this project. And that welcoming, the way that he welcomed me to the project, the way that he welcomed me to the campus, quite frankly, is the way that I try to continue. You talk about James being a mentor and how many of us have modeled aspects of our career on James. That is the attitude that I try to use, because I know how meaningful that was to me as a young person who was just coming to leaving a very different type of university, a small historically Black college, to go to this big University of Michigan. Not sure, fully confident that I could even, make it on that campus. And to meet the first Black professor who kind of took me in and said, look, you're going to come here, you're going to work with me, and I'm going to help you to develop your career. And he has done that. I would, there were times while I was his research assistant, he would ask me to go off and do some analysis, right? And I'm sure everyone here will relate to this. I would go do the analysis, run the models, come back and look for James, but I couldn't get to James because James was so busy doing so many other things. He was in DC, he was doing work for NIH, he was doing work for any and every imaginable thing, because James seemed to not have the ability to say no. By the way, as I watched that and said, I never want to be like that. In fact, I did the exact opposite, and I emulated James in so many ways, including the inability to turn down good people with good ideas, asking to get involved in important projects. So I'd come back looking for James, try to give him this data analysis that he asked me to run. So presumably he wanted to know what the findings were. And I quickly learned that the only way to do that is to go see Tony. So I'd go to Tony Antonucci and say, Tony, I need to get to James. And then Tony would always find some kind of way to get for me to get to him. James, I thought of James a couple of months ago, and I was talking to a doctoral student that I'm mentoring at another institution, and she had submitted an article. Actually, it was a grant proposal that she had submitted, and was proposing to do research on breast cancer among Black women, only among Black women, right? A battle that many of the people on this call right now, fought that battle for much of their careers. And she said that they didn't want to, that they liked the proposal, but they said that she needed a white comparison group. I'm sure everyone here has heard that story before. You need a white comparison group. You can't do a research on just Black people. And she came to me practically in tears, because the proposal was otherwise pretty well received, and I thought it was a really strong proposal. And I talked to her about James and the generation of scholars that James comes out of, and many of you on this call including Phil and Rob, and so I shouldn't have started naming names, but many of you on this call who also fought that battle, about how a generation of scholars had fought through that and pushed through that, and largely because of James and what he did, making it acceptable to do research on us, by us, on us, for us, to understand about us, and how we need to continue to push, and we needed to find ways to continue to follow and pursue the questions that we think are important. And it all came out of the experience of coming to Michigan, meeting James Jackson, becoming part of PRBA, understanding that it was something much bigger than just me and my own work, and that there was a larger goal here, which was to transform the work that was being done in our community. And I, was fortunate to be able to impart that experience to her and talk to her about how she was part of that link. She's another link in this chain of scholars who are who come out of this tree that James started. So I'm very honored and proud to be one of James Jackson's mentees. I try to carry that with me as I go forward in my role as mentor, and as I talk to future scholars and try to develop them. And I'm just thankful for that opportunity, and thankful to be a part of this family of PRBA scholars and alumnus.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, just to let you know, Thomas, Wendy and I had a miscommunication with that. We only thing I knew about was the hurricane and hurry up. So stay healthy. Um, Jamie Abelson.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to try not to cry, but I'm in the mood to cry. I think the first thing I want to say is one of the main reasons I'm grateful for having known James is that I've gotten to know so many of you over the years. And I can't just tell you how much gratitude I feel about that. I also decided I was going to tell a funny story tonight to help keep me on emotional evenness. But I'll tell two. One, I started at ISR in 1985, and I actually shared an office with David Williams when I was working for Ron Kessler. I joined PRBA in 1998 because of my mental health knowledge, and we were putting together NSAL, for those of you who don't know me. So believe it or not, the funny story I planned to tell was an airport story. And I'm going to tell it anyway. So I went with James to NIMH when the DSM-5 was being developed, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We arrived separately. And on the way home, we went together. So he offered to give me a ride home. And like you, I'm sure everybody on the call, I travel a fair amount, and you know when you have to leave your house, how many minutes before the flight to get there on time. And you know when a flight lands, you can estimate based on where you're sitting on the plane, how long it's going to take you to get home. So on this particular flight, we landed in Detroit. I was in the front of the back and he was in first class. And long story short, I was on the airplane and I was home in 1/2 hour. And that is half the time that it ever takes me. And I realized James traveled so much that he knew exactly where to walk, where to park the car. He knew every step to save him time. And of course, drove like the rest of the stories we've heard about. But I think it's very funny that that's the story I planned to tell so that I wouldn't get too tearful tonight. I would just like to say what I've been saying to everybody. None of us can replace James. None of us is James and has his particular set of gifts. But I'm just hoping that if everybody just steps up one notch, we can keep the work going and keep PRBA together and do the work that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. David Williams. And David, you are on mute.
Sorry. Good to see everybody. This is a wonderful reunion. I just want to talk briefly about just how much support I received from James and how much help he has been to my own career. And unlike most of the people who spoke tonight, I was like a late bloomer because I didn't really start to work with James until I was a tenured associate professor at Michigan. I knew him as a grad student in sociology, and I worked a little bit with Shirley Hatchett. That was my connection with PRBA. But I didn't actually work with James. But after I left and started my career, I actually started to have more conversations with James when I was no longer at Michigan. And one of the reasons I came back was, in fact, the opportunity to be a part of PRBA. And I'll never forget, I got this strong desire that we really needed to develop measures of discrimination. And I started reading on it and playing around with what these measures might look like. And one day I just shared with James what I was thinking about. And he said, let's do it. Let's do it. He was just like my cheerleader. Let's do it. And I talked about, the Detroit area study, maybe we could do it. He says, yes, and I'll do it with you. And James co-taught the Detroit area study with me. He said we can raise more money to supplement the sample. And we didn't get as much money as he thought he would get initially, but we got extra money to more than double the size of the sample. And I can't tell you how much it meant to me. This was a an idea I had that I didn't know if it was going to pan out. And James just was gung-ho, supportive, every step of the way. And I give James a lot of credit for what I have been able to do and the impact he's had on me. I would also just want to echo what Phil and Wayne said about two things about James that are unforgettable, is his optimism and his vision. James always had great ideas of this other plan, and we could do this, and we could do this, and we could do that. And of course, those famous immortal words, this grant is so easy, it will write itself, And I just am still, although I know James was sick, it's really hard to believe that James is actually gone. And I'm just very grateful for the way my life intersected with his, which he has meant to me.
Thank you, David. Cleopatra Caldwell.
Hi, it is so wonderful to see so many familiar faces from generations of involvement with PRBA. It is such a privilege to be here with all of you, and I use that privileged word in connection to James as well. I was sent to the University of Michigan to work with James. I was working with Larry Gary at Howard University, and I was accepted into a number of different graduate programs, and Gary just kept saying to me, "You're going to Michigan." And I said, "Oh no, I got options. I don't have to go to Michigan. You're going to Michigan and you're going to work with James Jackson." I said, "Okay." So I ended up in Michigan working with James Jackson as a graduate student. And it turns out almost 30 years later, James was still my primary mentor. I'm able to go with him with a number of different challenges that I'm facing in my professional career. But the story I want to tell is one related to that idea of optimism. James was fabulous at putting people together. And he's had this proposal in mind that he saw Barbara Guthrie and myself. Barbara was an expert in HIV and AIDS, and my focus was on families. And he thought we should come together and do this proposal, and it would be wonderful. So we did. Let me tell you how long ago this was. This is when the scoring system for NIH was 500 was the worst score that you could get, and 100 was the best score that you can get. Well, this was our first grant, and we came together to put this. We got our, that time it was called pink sheets, the pink sheets back, and we got a score of 400, okay? Anybody would be devastated to see a score of 400 out of 500. James came in, he had the pink sheets in his hand, he sat us down, and he said, "Oh, this is so good." And we looked at each other, what is he talking about? And he said, "Oh, no, the reviewers loved it. Let me show you where the positives are in these comments." And by the time James finished, he'd convinced us that we could actually write a proposal, that we could do this again. This is how we could go back in and try again. But the level of optimism that James is saying, nobody on earth would look at a score of 400 out of 500 and say that was positive. But that positive reinforcement is something that helped both Barbara and myself to this day in terms of our careers, where we are, because he convinced us that we could do it. And don't worry about this reviewer just didn't know what he was talking about here. That one didn't know what he was talking about there, but this is where all of the bright points are. So James was someone who was completely optimistic. I'm not going to take much more time because I know we have other people, but the only thing that I will say, because I have one of those Jamie airport stories of how he got me to the airport in 30 minutes. Don't want to say how I was unnerved by the time I got there, but I think that's one of James's specialties. But I want to say that I had the privilege of talking with Tony on the night that James passed. I was checking on him, and it turned out that was the exact night that he passed. So I felt like my entire career was really under the wings of James Jackson, and he'll always be there for us.
Don't get a 3 on me. I ain't doing that.
Oh, Woody might not have seen my text. Courtney Cockburn is next.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you and hear all these wonderful stories about James. I'll be brief as well. I'm going to set my timer and make sure I stay on track. So I'm a graduate of the Education and Psychology program, and I first met James because he helped recruit my brother to the University of Michigan into the School of Information, and they were planning to have coffee, and we arranged to plan, a secret meeting where I would just happen to drop by the coffee shop so I could get a chance to meet James. It was my first time interacting with him. And just like anyone else, if you got an introduction to James, you then became family. And he took me under his wing right away. But I really didn't get a chance to work with him until I was doing my later in my graduate program, and we were doing work in Brazil and South Africa. And again, just the optimism where James felt like you could do anything. I think simultaneously, though, anytime I felt like I had a new idea, the voice I have of James in my head is, yeah. We did a study in 1989 on that exact thing. And so it never felt like I quite had anything new to offer, especially as a doctoral student. He never made me feel that way. But, he had so many big ideas, had done so much in the span of his career that they really had done a study. You all had done studies in 1980, whatever. So that's the voice I hear in my head. Another story I have about James is, again, this optimism and this sort of, infinite well of confidence that he had in himself and everyone around him. He was asked to do a keynote and he couldn't do it. And he asked me to do it. And I was like fresh out of, grad school. And I was just, floored that he thought I could give this keynote address on his behalf. And I'm not 100% sure that he told them that I was the one that was going to show up before I got there. But again, I tapped into the, what would James Jackson say? I tapped into that voice that I'd been hearing over the course of my years working with him, and managed to pull it off. James also played a significant role in me getting my postdoc. And that's where I had a chance to work with David Williams and others, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society program. And I'm certain that he made phone calls on my behalf to help me get that position. But I also remember sort of taking that confidence with me that I developed over time, where I didn't feel like I needed to validate myself to white people in particular. I need to validate my research and my questions. And I remember in my interview at Harvard, where they were asking me why I wanted to do this. And I said, I think I could learn a lot and benefit a lot, but that this won't define me. Harvard will never define me. And in my mind, I was raised in Michigan, and there was no other place that was going to define who I was as a scholar, and that they would be lucky to have me there. I completely absorbed the James Jackson ethos. And the last thing I'll share is I've just sent my first round of students to their doctoral programs. Students who, barely knew what a PhD was, students who had been so beat up by their previous programs and didn't believe that they could do it. And I just channeled all of the mentorship that I got and gave it to them. And now they're off on their journey. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. Next, we have the three people who are going next are AJ, Deborah Robinson, and Vicki Mays. So AJ.
Well, hello to everyone, and it's so good to see everyone and have this opportunity to say thank you for James. And what do I mean by that is that having sat with James, I met him in about 69 and 70, and we were starting our careers, and he was visionary, and he was, the better word is grandiose, because a number of times I thought as the clinician was going to commit him, he had such grandiosity. He called it vision. At times I called it grandiosity. But he had commitment and passion. And to see someone to be a friend, a brother, and to be with someone over 50 some odd years and to see an embryo of an idea be implanted, to have birthed like the PRBA and to just grow into adulthood as his vision has and spawn so many progeny is just an incredible experience to be with someone from sort of birth to this point. And so all of you are, you know, including myself in many respects, are children of a great vision. And so for James, I want to say thank you for all that you have done, have become, and continue to do. Related to that is, I remember Carl Bell and I a number of times talked to James about how to archive, how to continue this thing, you know, and that was difficult because, you know, my brother was always generating ideas, you know, and it was kind of hard to get him to land on some things without him generating another idea and taking off. And I know Carl and I kept saying, you know, we have to figure out a way to make sure that this is archived, that there's a way others can continue to have access to all of the legacy as well as all of the vision of things to come. So I would share that with all of you, is to continue to figure out a way to maintain the rich archive of data that you have and figure out a way to disseminate it. That was the other thing that Carl and I talked a lot to James about. But it's been really a privilege and an honor to just be a part of the PRBA family. You can imagine I have a lot of stories over 50 some odd years, and I don't know, you know, where to begin. You have car stories. So I remember James and I were, first of all, we were roommates for 2 weeks in South Africa. That was an experience in and of itself. We had been roommates before, but not that long a period of time. And particularly when we had to go from one place to the other. And then I became the designated driver in Durban. And, you know, it's used to, you know, because we drove on the other side. So I was on the right side driving and James was on my left, constantly giving me instructions about, do you know where you're going, AJ, in Durban? Have you ever been here before? Now, and so, and of course he was commenting on how I was driving. And I said, well, you want to drive? He says, no. I think you're doing great. Go ahead. But he was an incredible, energetic buddy, you know, and is rich with ideas and compassion for people and dedication to social justice in so many different ways. And it was an honor and privilege to be close to him. He was constantly pulling me into one thing versus another. I kept telling him I had a career too, other than what he envisioned for me, that there was some independence there. And he was grateful for that. And of course, yeah, I'm really am going to miss my buddy and my brother, but with all of you still being emblematic of everything that he stood for, I'm comforted in the knowledge of knowing that his vision and what he stands for and his legacy is very much going to be protected and enshrined by the work and success of multiple generations in the future. So keep the faith, and just thank you for allowing me to be a part of the family. And I know Nancy feels very much the same way, because Tony and Nancy and I go back a long way.
Yeah. And guess, if you don't mind, I'm sorry, Nancy, you go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say what Courtney said. You were around James 5 minutes, you became family. No question.
Yeah. And we, you know, because I know most of the people, I just said AJ, because we always say AJ, but for younger scholars in particular, that's Anderson James Franklin and Nancy Boyd Franklin, just so everybody knows. Next we have Deborah Robinson. Deborah, we cannot hear you. I should say I can't hear you. Okay, if you don't mind, Deborah, we'll go ahead just because, and why don't you play around for a second, but right now we can't hear you. Dr. Vicky Mays, another West Coast person.
It is so wonderful to see everybody, because normally in June when you have the reunion, I'm still teaching. So this is just a sea of wonderful memories in addition to the things that many of you are saying. I want to tell a story of today, and then I want to tell a story of yesterday's. But today, as Robert knows, we're doing the proofs for a paper that's a PRBA paper. And I just kind of decided today I was going to write in the, Robert doesn't even know this yet, but that I was going to write at the end of the paper when it asked about further research. I said, and I did a whole thing about launching a new study. And I really thought about James when I did that. It's like, you know, he is, it's everybody saying, he's so optimistic. He's like, oh yes, just do that. It's wonderful. And I was like, you know, I need to put it out there. James has trained so many of us that one of us or some of us could do this. And so I decided, like, you know, to put it in the universe in terms of it's time to do another one. And I went through all the reasons why it's time to do it and the importance of it. So this was kind of weighing on my mind today. And so I kind of went a little off on the paper, Robert. So, but I think it's really apt because James gave us a lot. And I think that we, as somebody said, we need to step up. We need to realize that as we come together as a group, there is nothing we can't do, including moving a 400 to a 100, Cleo. That's absolutely the kinds of things that James taught us. But like AJ, I really want to say a thank you because I'm very clear. I have no doubts that I am tenured at UCLA because of the work that James put out there. For me, the story was, I remember this, we do a review every 2 years when you're assistant professor. So at the end of my second year, my chair brings me in and he says, you know, if you keep trying to do this political stuff, which meant working on Black people, you'll keep trying to do this political stuff and you're not going to get tenure. And I looked at him and I said, please don't cuss the man out, please. They said they hired you because this was really okay to do, but yet they were criticizing doing it. And I decided I am not going to stop. I'm going to find a way to do it better. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, so we often had very small samples. And so as soon as I found out, I was one of the first postdocs, a summer postdoc at PRBA. And I needed that kind of data. And I made it, you know, such that I worked very hard to get the data in these places where they wanted to see it, to prove to them that this was a worthy task, to prove to them that there were accomplishments that needed to be made with this data. So, you know, it's without that data, because I was not going to give up doing research on Black people. I mean, that I wasn't going to. And given kind of the, you know, the nature of some of these universities, I needed that data. But I also needed to know how to say what needed to be said. And I always say that there were 2 times where I learned how to write the end of a paper. And that was with James, where it's about what's next and what is it that we can change in the world. So I really, you know, it's that enthusiasm that he had. And it's like nothing's too high to strive for. So I learned that those last paragraphs, to write them that way so that some other scholar would pick up the baton, or that NIH would see that people were making this request, or that somebody that we didn't know could go and have an argument about, well, this research should be done. And the other place I learned it is when I was at the RAND Corporation. I learned then how to write those things relative to policy. So I think what James did was transformed my ability to be able to be a scholar that could contribute in a way in which it left a pathway to say, not only is it okay to do what we do, but it is needed and necessary, and it's insufficient if we don't continue to do it. So today, with this very heavy heart, I wrote in here about, launching the next study. So I don't know which of us will pick it up, but it is in the world now for, it to happen. So I have to thank Jane for having a lot of that same optimism. And I just don't let this, the junior scholars are often ask me, I said, please do not let those white people, in any way inflate your dream. I said, what you need to look at is who is there, and that's us. What we can support you in doing, and that's telling you how awesome you are. And we're also reviewers. It's not enough of us, but you should think about the more positive ways. And that's the generations we see, and you all need to just keep on doing it in the name of James.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vicki. We're going to try Dr. Deborah Robinson again, and we hope we get her.
Oh my gosh. Oh, okay, now?
Yeah, you're good. We hear you.
Thanks. Thank God. Then I went away. Okay, this is great to be with everybody here. Thank you so much for organizing this. I just wanted to share a word because I think my story has been different from most people. I worked with James and so many people here on National Survey of Black Americans and National Black Election Study. So really from 1978 to 87. But then I started doing everything except be a scholar. Did a lot of social justice work, did a lot of work in other countries, did environmental justice work, did work at the United Nations. But I started talking and kind of kept the relationship with PRBA and James. About 4 years ago, I started talking with James about, it took that long, 30 years, for me to come up with a survey that I really wanted to do. And I started talking with James about this idea of really looking at African Americans currently living abroad. And the fact that, I said, James, this really needs to be a part of PRBA. Well, everyone shared how James has been so supportive through the decades. It's just amazing to me how supportive James has been, and then brought me back to PRBA and brought the project, We Global African Americans Living Abroad, to PRBA. When he didn't need to do this. He didn't need, at this point in his life to be the cheerleader or to really facilitate this. So I will always be indebted to James and indebted to PRBA because I've learned so much from so many of you. And I think in the next period, we'll be learning so much from you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Deborah. Let me mention one or two things because we have about 15 more minutes left or so. And so, the last year James was ill, but still working really hard. I said last, I believe 2.5, 3.5 years, but really working hard, but mostly, not exclusively, but mostly working from home. And so some of the younger scholars who were, like postdocs at ISR, didn't have much time to meet James or spend time with James. And plus, some of us, the faculty, we're in and out between, ISR and our other home buildings. But our next speaker is Lauren Brown, and Lauren was a postdoc, just started at San Diego State. And Lauren was mentored, and probably the most recent mentee, because she was part of the summer program that was held this past June that I mentioned earlier. So I'm gonna ask Lauren to say a few words.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Robert, so much for inviting me and letting me share today. I first want to say that I felt James much sooner than I ever met him. I did my PhD at the University of Southern California on the West Coast, and it was obvious that University of Michigan had something incredibly special in that they housed one of the most prominent researchers who studied Black Americans. And I was primed to get in touch with him from the second I stepped onto campus. But I still didn't meet him until actually this past summer, and I'm 7 years in. And I used to walk by every day when I would go to work in ISR. I would walk by a picture on the right-hand side, which was Malcolm X and MLK, and on the left-hand side, it was James Jackson. And I would say hi to them every morning, but still hadn't met James. And then this summer, I got the opportunity to work with him for a week, an intensive week in June. And I think I knew then how incredibly special the week was and how important it was to get that time with him. But it wasn't until 2 weeks ago that I recognized maybe the magnitude of him passing on a lot of that knowledge and this idea of supporting Black faculty, and the promotion and tenure of Black faculty is something that he exuded from the depths of his soul. And it's something that I think we can see all here, that we all are absolutely a reflection of what he proposed, regardless of where you fall in political lines, religious lines, any of the drama that happens between these social circles. He promoted Black faculty above all else. And it's something that I think I'll take into my career as well.
Thank you, Lauren. We have one more speaker from our political science wing, Kahari Brown.
Hello, everyone. I work with James on the National Politics Study, and I really enjoy talking with him about the latest political issues in the news. You might not believe this, but he was not a big Trump fan. Didn't like the guy at all, actually. Not good. A lot of our conversations were about that. I mean, I've been working with James in the National Politics Study before he passed, as well as past 10 years. And a lot of our informal conversations about Trump and other topics would lead to research questions that we ended up pursuing in grants and papers. And this was a lot of fun for me because a lot of the political questions that we came up with aren't included in most political surveys like the Pew or the Gallup or the American National Election Study. So I'm talking about questions on social movements, racial identity, and social justice side of religion. And these types of questions really made my career. And it really helped a lot of my colleagues and a lot of our former students. And so like a lot of people have already stated, he made me feel really confident about my research agenda and that it was valuable and worth pursuing.
Thank you, Kahari. So is there anybody else that would like to speak? I just want to make sure we get everybody who wants a chance. It's really good to hear from Lauren, who's probably, by far the youngest scholar in terms of youngest mentee, I should say. And I just want to mention
Robert,
yes.
Me.
Yes, dear. She always does this to me, but it's all good. You just see her in programs.
It definitely is all good. So, hearing everyone's talk and their recollections and memories of James, I'd like to share two things. One is sort of a funny thing. He had a lot of nicknames. And I recall one nickname that Robert and I attached to him. those of you who grew up in the 1960s and watched cartoons, Warner Brother cartoons, may remember a character called the Tasmanian Devil. And the Tasmanian Devil was this wild creature that ran around, tons of energy, just frenetic energy. And we called him the Tasmanian Devil. And I can't recall whether we purchased a t-shirt with him, for him with that logo, or a cup. But it definitely was, it personified his boundless energy. So that's my one funny recollection. The other recollection I have is something that I share with doctoral students, students that I mentor, about something that I experienced after my prelim, getting the prelim done. And I call it the post-prelim slump. And what it was for me, I was just essentially tired. You write the prelim, it's huge, it's big. Isn't that enough? And lo and behold, no, it wasn't enough. There was still the dissertation. But the post-prelim slump for me was really sort of taking it easy and just enjoying life. And I recall running into James outside of ISR. And he hadn't seen me in a while because I was in my post-prelim slump, which is / kind of just taking it easy. And he said, Linda, what are you doing? Where have you been spending your time? Are you moving forward on your dissertation? I really want to see you step up your game right now. I wasn't expecting to have that conversation that day, and it really stopped me cold in my tracks. And I think it took me maybe one day to sort of process everything. And then I went and saw him, and I said, I'd like to work on the project. And it wasn't difficult because he showed that he was someone who believed in my abilities and in my promise. And he just needed to shake up my world a little bit because I was just getting a little bit too comfortable being an ABD. That's something that I share with students that I mentor because it's a real story. There is a post-prelim slump or a post-prelim pause where you kind of say, I've done a lot, and then you come to realize I've still got something left to do. So that is part of the mentoring that I take on the students that James taught me. Not only that you need to keep moving, but that he has, we should have faith in the ability and the promise of our students.
Hey, thank you, Linda. And so I just want to mention one or two last things. So number one, Del Jerome is here. Del is James's longtime administrative assistant. Worked with him at Rackham and then moved over and worked with him and us at PRBA. Andrea Leapson was on here for a while. She was an early NSBA, I'm gonna just say jack of all trades, you know. I can't go through everybody. I would love to. We just don't have that kind of time, but it's just wonderful to see everybody. What we're definitely gonna do is we're definitely gonna have another reunion. I talked to James about reunions. James did not want a reunion. He's sort of like, we need something to celebrate. We ain't got nothing to celebrate, so why are we gonna have a reunion? So he wasn't having it. We talked 2 or 3 times about it, but we're definitely gonna do something, and it may be virtual, but we will work it out just to let everybody know. And again, I really appreciate everybody coming in, and I'm gonna now have Dr. Woody Neighbors take it on home.
All right, thank you, Dr. Robert Joseph Taylor. The Joseph is very important. As Robert has told me many times, there are a lot of Robert Taylors out there, but for me, there's only one Robert Joseph Taylor. And I know my man, Robert. We shared an office at ISR that was, I'll just say, very cozy. It was quite small. But we didn't complain. It was no problem because PRBA was the mission. Robert, I want to thank you for giving me an opportunity to close. I didn't know you were going to give me this opportunity, but I'm glad you gave me some time to think about it. And so I'm going to tell one short James Jackson travel story. Since you gave me the mic again, you probably shouldn't have done that, but it's too late now. And then I want to finish up by reading something that I wrote about James many years ago. So the other part of my Toronto trip story that I cut out was that when James and I got to Toronto, I was well rested because I was in the habit of sleeping every night. You know, even though I was young, I felt it was a good idea to sleep every night. James, on the other hand, had been ripping and running, and I don't know when he last slept. So we're at the conference, and we're about to go on. And James says, hey, Woody, you need to give me a few minutes. I need to get prepared for our presentation. So I was like, yeah, cool. You know, I thought he was going to pull out his notes and, you know, walk me through what we were going to say. And what he was really telling me was that he was going to have to take a power nap. Now, a lot of you by now are familiar with a power nap, but you got to keep in mind, I didn't know what was going on. I had never been introduced to the concept of a power nap. So James sat in a wooden chair. He sat straight up, folded his arms, and went into a deep sleep for 8 minutes. Then he woke up and we went on and did our thing. So that was James. Love to travel with James. Wish I was still traveling with James. I think
that's called a power nap.
Yeah, that's called a power nap. Thank you, Dr. Bowman. So I'm going to read just the first and last paragraph of something I wrote about James back in '04, just to express, you know, how I've always felt about him and what he did for me and what he did for all of us. He really provided a home. You know, I'll say that for me. He provided a comfortable home where I felt really safe. Quick sidebar, I had an uncle who's born and raised in Ann Arbor, and he ended up in Washington, D.C., and so I used to see him all the time because I was living in Pennsylvania. Every story my uncle told me about growing up in Ann Arbor was about how racist a town Ann Arbor was. And so I swore I would never go to Ann Arbor. So I couldn't believe that I was actually going to school, given what I had learned from my uncle about all of the things he had to endure as a black man growing up in Ann Arbor. But there I was, headed for Ann Arbor in 1975. And so I'm just going to read the first and last paragraph. In September 1975, an anxious, slightly scared 22-year-old walked into the ISR for the first time. As he rounded the corner of the 5th floor hallway to meet, for the first time, his doctoral academic advisor, he could not help but wonder, what is this going to be like? This young man was slightly scared because he had been warned by his undergraduate faculty, quote, "Those folk out of Michigan don't play. You need to be on top of your game." But he thought to himself, what game? I have no game. So he rounded that corner, trying desperately to put on his game face, and he was greeted with a loud, booming, friendly, "Hi, how you doing? I'm James Jackson." there stood a young-looking black man with a mustache, goatee, and most of all, a big wide smile and an outstretched hand. Sometimes you catch a lucky break and you find yourself in the right place at the right time. And that was me. So I want to close by reading the last paragraph from the heart. I will be forever indebted to him for the strong support he has given me over the years. As my academic advisor, he was instrumental in assuring that there was never a time during my graduate career when I did not have some source of financial support. And everybody on this call knows how important financial support is. James always made sure I had it. As director of the NSBA, he provided me with a unique opportunity to gain quality, hands-on experience in survey research methods. James was also the major source of criticism and feedback as I began formulating my ideas on mental health and help seeking. And from an intellectual standpoint, I have found his input to be truly stimulating. In short, James has been a teacher and a friend. So those are my words to close this incredible evening. And I just want to say good luck, well wishes, and most of all, stay safe to everybody in the sound of my voice. All right, Robert, I yield the rest of my time back to you.
Thank you, Woody. Thank you, everybody. Guess one last thing on if you have anything positive that's happened in the last year, please email me. We'll get something out in the next few weeks. Okay. We have, we have some sad news, but we have also lots of good news. So please, let's share the good news also. So have a good evening. Thank everybody for showing up. And it's great seeing everybody.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Great to
Bye.
see you all.
Beautiful.
Bye. Thanks,
Robert.
Bye-bye.
David.
Be well.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye, Dr. Bill.
Hey. Hey, Ruby.
Hey.
Take care. Good to see you. Talk to you soon, Debbie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, go blue.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi,
everybody. BT Express.
Bye. Bye-bye.
I had to get that in there.
Yes, thank you. Good to see you, first roommate. Linda Chatters. Office mate, I should say roommate.
Hi, Cleo.
Bye, Cleo.
Hey, Cleo.
Talk to you soon, Cleo.
I need to
I missed
unmute.
it, Judah.
And hi, Susan.
Wow.
I just said hi to Susan.
Oh, Susan. Oh, yeah, Susan's on.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, Susan.
Oh, we need a list of names of everybody who was on, Robert.
And Benita, let's try her name. Oh.
Hey, Ruby. How you doing?
Good.
Good to see you. Remember those days at North Campus? We were hanging out.
Oh, my goodness. Northwood 5.
Northwood 5. That's where it was happening.
That's right.
Back in the day. Yeah. Good to see you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Yeah, with kids and grandchildren. It's hard to get off. Hard to say goodbye.
Yeah, people don't want to hang out.
Karen, I see your son
hey, Russell.
there.
Hi.
And
Yeah,
he can come to the reunions with you.
He's growing.
He's growing.
I saw you, Russell. You there?
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
No.